Hey everybody. I am here in Golden Gate Park. Here you can see a little bit of what's going on. There's a lot of people out here enjoying the sunshine, observing what we presently refer to as social distancing. It's beautiful weather. It's springtime. It's the right on the verge of the full moon in the in the moon cycle that I believe is the duck moon, though I cannot recall the sophisticatedly multisyllabic Blackfoot word for this moon at the moment. Nor am I going to interrupt what I'm doing to look that up. Someday I'll remember all those words. It is good to be outside. I think in Blackfoot, ixokapi is the word good. So I still have a little bit of Blackfoot vocabulary. Very modest portion, I'll admit, but precious to me. For even though it is not the language of my people, it is a language, so if I could even tell who my people were. And by the way, if I were going to tell who were my people, how would I go about that exactly? One answer is family history, right? I would inquire of my forebears, and they've told me things about who our people are that I remember, but most of them have passed on. And the carriers of our stories are our elders. They are the carriers of the narrative history of our families. And so, for many of us, both our elders themselves, certainly, and these stories, these are extremely precious. They're irreplaceable anchors of identity and history and knowledge. But they are also the living bodies of our beloved progenitors. There is no knowledge or information that can replace the heartful fact of the presence in physical proximity of one's ancestors. However conflicted our history with them may be, and in some cases, I'm well aware there are many people who have no desire to ever see their ancestors again, or some of them, because they had very difficult or painful childhood experiences, or teenage experiences, or young adult experiences, or adult experiences. Nevertheless, we hold our elders in reverence generally as the kind of animal that we are. And as I've often said, any specific instance of a moment, or a person, or a relationship will have unique features. So the fact that we generally hold our ancestors in reverence doesn't mean that everyone does. And perhaps here in the United States, this is less true than it is in older cultures, where the family tends to stay bonded very closely throughout their entire lives, right? So that the mother remains the mother, and the father remains the father, and the children remain the children, and so on and so forth. And this may seem anathema to our modern, quote unquote, often that modernity mostly indicates amputations of stuff that's really important to us, but that's not the only thing it indicates. The idea of individuality that pervades American, modern American experience has very dangerous aspects and potential ramifications, right? Consequences. But our ancestors, and so too our children, these are the living bodies of memory. Don't know if you can see this, but watch. When I make the high-pitched sound, the little insects gather all around me and orbit me. I've had people claim that that wasn't a real phenomenon because they can't conceive of being able to interact with insects in such a way that your voice just draws them to you. And I won't claim that it's not largely a scientific phenomenon. Well, yes, I will. Science can give us insight into some features of our physical situation and our rational situations. But there are many aspects of being and life that science is fundamentally unequipped to explore or explain or perceive or model or inform us about, right? Science is a specific array of methods and tools, incredibly useful where it's useful, often very dangerous where it's not. But I was speaking about embodied memory and how our ancestors and our children, and indeed ourselves, are examples of embodied memory. Now, if I were to go to one of my ancestors and ask them to tell me who our people are, they would reference their ancestors and what they were told, who in turn referenced their ancestors and what they were told. And what would result is a string of narratives. And today I'm going to be talking a bit about the relationship between narratives, memory, and identity. So let me ask you a question that might seem a bit too simple on the surface. How do you know who you are? How do you know? And in fact, I suspect it would be impossible to explain who you are, and the reason is that explanations cannot capture the diverse experiences and felt senses, intuitions, thoughts, phenomena, dreaming, imagination that our humanity emerges in the cloud of. Right? There's no explanation or description that will help me, that will encompass your identity. Yeah? You can tell me stories, narratives, right? and you can list qualities or experiences, preferences, likes, dislikes. Sound familiar, those two words, by the way? But fundamentally, the way you know who you are is because you have access to this store. Now that's a metaphor, of course, but you have access to this library of memorial information. And if that library were to go away for some reason, even if it were to be momentarily suspended, how would you know who you are? And here's a perhaps slightly more provocative question. A question asked or posed by many spiritual traditions, and particularly meditation traditions. What if you could momentarily be free of those memories? What if just for a moment you could suspend all the memorial ideation and figures that you depend upon to believe that you know who you are? What if we could just pause that for a moment? What would happen? What might we learn? What might we become capable of that we are otherwise incapable of? Now, of course, we have pathological states and situations, things we refer to as dementia, or we, I think, largely misuse this word medically, but another term we use is Alzheimer's disease. These are examples of the consequences of suffering various kinds of brain and perhaps metabolic damage due to the progression of what we call an illness. And I believe it is an illness. Although, again, when we use language, we should be careful to maintain some ambiguity, right? We don't necessarily want to disbelieve things which are relatively provable facts, but we might benefit from reintroducing some ambiguity there. And in a sense, one of the things I'm engaged in right now, one of the things I hope to explore together, is what it would be like for us if a little ambiguity were introduced into our personal experience of who we are. And over the past couple of days, I've been thinking very carefully about the relationship between narratives, memory, identity, and two specific phrases that I've become momentarily fascinated by. The first is disambiguation, which is to reduce the cognitive or sensorial ambiguity in thought or experience, right? To go from like, oh, I hear something, to, oh, I think that's an animal, to, that sounds like a raccoon, to, that's a raccoon. That's a process of disambiguation. And humans, like myself and you and all the other humans, we, while we're awake particularly, rely upon this process of disambiguation, but most of us are not very skillful with it. In fact, language is one of the tools we use to disambiguate our experience, and most of us have an incredibly primitive grasp, such a primitive grasp that although the fact that we can speak and read is a very powerful advantage over someone who cannot, we have to sacrifice other faculty. Well, we don't have to. we tend to sacrifice an array of other faculties that would ordinarily be a part of our experience of our own minds and intelligence and relational capacities and opportunities and abilities and so on. Many of these are sacrificed because the price we pay for the disambiguation's language can deliver is far, far too high, much higher than it needs to be. And the primary reason for this is just that our ancestors, well, actually, there is no simple explanation of that. Over the evolution of modern human consciousness, we lost faculties of memory, identity, and intelligence, whole dimensions of these things, as we gained conveniences like writing, accounting, law, computation, telepresence, so on and so forth, right? So as we were stacking up these conveniences, we never did any accounting about what they would cost. And long ago, wise men and women realized, they were very concerned about the onset of writing, because they suspected, quite rightly, that for nearly everyone, this would result in catastrophic deficits of skill and capability in relation to memory. They were right. And our people, in, say, the last 500 years, just to pick an arbitrary interval, we have continued to fall down that mountainside catastrophically, so that now people actually depend on their handheld computing devices to act as extra vocabulary, or even to remediate the problems with knowledge and memory that we've developed as a result of becoming far too intimate with technology and failing to develop the kinds of memory arts that were common among our ancestors. What kinds of memory arts am I referring to? Well, there were certainly people capable of remembering 1,000 pages of text. To, as I understand it, to merely open the sun dance in one indigenous culture, something like 100 songs are required to be performed essentially perfectly by one of the participants. There were songs long ago that lasted days. At some point in human history, there were people capable of singing the entire Torah. And by the way, one of the first sacrifices one of the earliest and perhaps least remembered of sacrifices was the sacrifice of music to speech. Yeah, this is before writing, all right? Although, if you think about it, it's probably easier to remember something that has musical accompaniment than it is to merely remember spoken language. Yeah? That musical accompaniment gives you all kinds of felt senses and cues and sort of hooks on which you can more easily hang the relatively monotonous verbal content. Okay, here's some more of these gnats. So if I make even a sound at all, if I just clear my throat, the gnats leap, right? So that's not an optical illusion. Oh. slower, low tones cause them to collect. Higher, faster frequencies cause them to disperse. But some frequencies draw them directly toward me. As you can see, language is music, and the gnats respond to it, whether I make it musical, or whether I simply speak. Now, there's a lot of ground I want to cover, and I'm not going to have enough time to cover all of it today, most likely. But I've outlined some of the problems that face us as moderns in our relationship with memory. There are practices that individuals can learn. We can teach our children and each other, if we are interested. We can recover the arts of memory together, to whatever degree we are willing or interested in doing so. And one of the reasons I make these videos, excuse me, is not because I expect other people are going to be, very interested and fascinated and compelled, even though I do certainly hope that that might happen once or twice. It's partly because I am practicing improvising around an array of topics so that I can keep my vocabulary alive and my creative ability to speak extempore alive, right? I need, these things are, by the way, if someone said like, well, why? I'd say, because that's who I am. There's that narrative, right? I associate an array of skills and behaviors and preferences and histories and ideas and passions and hatreds and preferences and qualities. All of these things I associate with who I am. It's funny, I'm now walking again through the area in which I was first asking this question some few minutes ago. And also, where I was asking the question of what would happen if we could voluntarily suspend that. Surely to be cripplingly deprived of it due to illness or disease is a terrifying catastrophe, a tragedy that we would all wish to avoid and that no one would wish on any other human being. Because to be without memory at all, it's funny, we might use the word vegetative, but that's a metaphor, and it's a very badly formed metaphor, because you can see all around me the incredible life that is the vegetation, yeah? And that vegetation is not insensate, though many might argue it isn't fully sentient. And I would make very complex arguments like the sentience with which people would make that assertion depends precisely on that stuff that they're pretending isn't smart, right? Doesn't have memory, is not intelligent, isn't sentient. I think our sentience floats on the transcendent underpinnings of the entire biosphere and perhaps time-space itself, with good reason. But I'm not trying to convince you of that. Form your own opinions, make your own, inquiries. So surely it's a tragedy to be deprived inexorably of memory and identity and our felt sense of being who we are. But might it not also be true that because we are incapable of voluntarily releasing the narratives that bind us to our ideas of ourselves, might it not also be true that that is a kind of tragedy? that is a form of deprivation, and I will assert forcefully that this is so. And if this were not so, these traditions where we pay very close attention to the breathing, our bodies, the moment of our mental experience, these traditions would not flourish. And they flourish. And they flourish precisely because they have the potential to grant people a momentary reprieve from the prison of personal identity. Now again, I don't want to make any kind of claims like, well, we should just get rid of that. That's not what I'm saying at all. In fact, I'm saying something very different. I'm saying a one-winged bird doesn't fly well. To actually understand what it means to have identity and to be able to embody that and experience it meaningfully, we have to have something at least similar to its polarity, right? We have to have something that is to that thing's right hand as my left hand is to me, right? And of course we do. In the waking world, we use narratives to disambiguate, narratives and lexicons, language and ideas, concepts, and so on, to disambiguate. But at night, when we fall asleep, we begin to dream. And when we begin to dream, ambiguity is reintroduced into our sense of ability, identity, history, future, relationships. And this is an unimaginably useful insight. When I first was able to say something like this, it shocked me. This is the kind of thing that most of us are unconsciously aware of, but we have no way to form either conscious experience of or description or language about that might help us to recognize it in consciousness. This relationship between disambiguation and reambiguation. Yeah. Now, the other night, I was in a conversation with two friends, and we were talking about experiences and thoughts about the nature of dreaming. And I began to realize, as we spoke together about stories we had read when we were children, a very unusual kind of thought began to dawn on me. And it took a while to become formal enough to be disambiguated to the degree that I could actually formulate it in language. And what that thought was something like this. Narratives, we use them for all kinds of things in our mental experience and in our social experience and in our personal experience. We make use of narratives. Narratives are, in this sense, tool-like. And some might argue that, in a way not dissimilar to how our technologies end up making use of us, right? One could argue cars make use of humans to reproduce. even though they're not a proper they are objects. Yeah? But because of the unique relationship with convenience and perhaps manual facility that humans have, cars make use of our species to reproduce. And so too do narratives and ideas. And this is the idea that underlies a range of concepts that can be explored in different ways, some of them more useful than others. The concept of a meme is a contagious media object these days, but prior to that, it was probably initially formulated in that way by Richard Dawkins, a man who, for all of his intelligence, is 3/4 blind, in my view. But we could say that narratives and ideas, when exposed to human hosts and populations, they use us as reproductive terrain, actually, and reproductive organs. Right? We become the reproductive organs of narratives. And that's what a political system is, and that's what a religion is, and that's often largely what a philosophy is. All of the aspects of our common human experience are deeply informed by narratives, and most of them we didn't form, right? In other words, we caught them. We caught them like a disease, and then we reproduced them, just as in a way analogous to how a contagious person communicates a disease. Walking through more gnats. I'm fascinated by those creatures. They're really amazing. Their relationship to sound is just, I never overcome my fascination with it. I can sit for hours and sing with gnats and just be completely content. So the insight that I had that kind of blew me away, because I've thought very carefully for many years about the relationship between memory and identity, and what we actually call intelligence or creativity or imagination. All of these things are behaviors, they're mental activities that depend on not just memory, but specific forms of relation with memory and specific purposes of relation with memory. And so it's no accident that the Greeks called mnemosyne the mother of the muses, because she is memory. And by the way, this is associated with water, in case that isn't clear to you. No pun intended. This is associated with water, in case that isn't clear. That wasn't a total accident. But this stuff up here, there's actually a lot of water up there, right? We call it clouds, and there's a lot of water vapor around here. We call it moisture. But the sky was understood by the ancients. The metaphor with which they understood the sky varied from people to people and time to time, but was very commonly one related to an ocean, right? It was the sky ocean. And so mnemosyne in memory was associated with the sky. And in case it isn't clear to you, the idea of constellations, which we pretend were used fundamentally for navigation, no, navigation was a side effect. Navigation was a little toy off to the side of what the star field actually comprised for many of our ancestral progenitors. The star field was a memory palace. They could paint stories and techniques on that star field the way I can paint lyrics on music. Yeah? And so it became for them, there's a living creature here. It was for them a meta library. It wasn't merely a library, it was an extension of their own memory. And so too, if you talk with indigenous people, they will tell you blatantly, explicitly, that living places and the shapes and forms of relationships in those places and the specific landmarks, that even those that transform over time, these were a mind they accessed as though it were intimately, personally familiar to them. And so if you were to take, for example, an elder and drive them through the ancestral lands, they would begin emitting, right, profusions of memorial information about what happened here and when and how it happened and who was there and what the circumstances were and what the context is and all these things, so that the living places were both companions and forms of memory. So memory underlies, in a fundamental way, our experience and the potentials of our humanity. And most of us will have very little experience with this throughout our lives. We'll have a very casual relationship with these topics, a utilitarian one. We will think we know who we are. We will believe the narratives we tell ourselves or have been told by others. We will circulate them, and we will live and die in this unfortunately deprived circumstance. But we don't have to. We can make other choices together. And part of the opportunity to make other choices begins with being able to think in more complex and useful ways that bear a greater likeness to our humanity and our intelligence and the faculties innate to us, and the faculties that are potentials within us, but that don't awaken unless they're properly fertilized. And let's be clear, most of our faculties are of this type. So you might think you have like 50 or 60 or 80 or 100 different things you can do or become. No, there are billions of things we can do and become. The list of faculties that is native to the human animal is infinite. And if there is something astonishingly advanced about the kind of animal we are, it is this. How unfortunate it is for our people and for the living world that the faculties we've thus far commonly expressed are mostly, or at least too often, like diseases. And in case it isn't clear, diseases aren't faculties, right? No one would pretend that dementia is a faculty. Yeah? And yet we're suffering something like, at the species level, something very similar. The loss of the potential to embody the endless jungles of potential intelligence and behavior and relationships native to our incarnate human existence. Now, I can sing the praises of memory for hours, but I want to get to a key insight that occurred to me last night. And it's whenever something like this happens, I feel like I won the lottery. I feel so lucky to have the chance to not merely notice, but to recall and perhaps even communicate about something this astonishing. As I was listening to my friends and we were talking about reading a lot of science fiction when we were younger and stuff like this, and other, stories of wonder, it suddenly occurred to me that narratives structure memory. And different forms of structured memory are capable of different kinds of faculties. They're capable of different expressions of creativity or imagination or intelligence or noticing. The iconic stereotype of the Indian tracker who can track a grasshopper through a field. I don't take this as fiction. This is an example of the kinds of faculties available to human beings, but they depend on having structured memory in such a way that it benefits from multiple underlying potential forms that in combination become a superposition over what would commonly be our experience of perception or understanding or awareness. Yeah? And so I suddenly realized, that the thousands of science fiction stories I read as a child were structuring my memory. They were building the precursors of non-human intelligences within me. And eventually, one day, there was an unimaginably profound catalyzation event where those potentials integrated and produced something beyond my capacity to explain or describe. So, the point that I want to make is that the narratives that we're exposed to, there are different species of narratives, and they have different purposive relationships with memory. And as we are exposed to these narratives, the underlying structures and capacities and purposes for which we will interact with our own memories change. And this implies a technology, right? A cognitive technology and a relational, like an auto-relational or a self-relational, but also a public face of this technology, a socially relational aspect. To the relationship between the narratives we encounter, share, and sustain together, and the underlying transformations of memory they induce. This is one of the most shocking realizations I've had in years. The potential for revolutionary transformation implicit in this one insight is infinite. I'm not claiming that I'll be able to make the best use of it or that we can change the course of our species, but this is the kind of insight that potentiates that creates that possibility. The insight that the narratives that we compose, inherit, exchange, and transform together, they restructure the possibilities of our relationship with memory. And this kind of insight immediately explains all kinds of historical phenomenon that we are familiar with. We can see entire peoples throughout history absolutely captivated by some narrative, and once thus captivated, perfectly willing to sacrifice themselves or obliterate forests and the oceans and to kill their neighbors wantonly, to believe themselves the chosen people or the chosen person or the avenger of the divine or the one who will see into the nature of light and time, right? These narratives fundamentally structure the purposes for which we relate with memory, and thus the results of our mental activity, the character, the accomplishments, the deprivations. So we don't know who we are just by telling ourselves stories, though that's part of how we know. We know something of who we are by the way the stories we tell structure our relationships with memory. And surely there are kinds of narratives. So one of the things I wanted to mention is it should be obvious there are different species of narratives, right? Some of these have an incredibly deleterious effect on human creativity or insight or awareness or intelligence. Some of them are relatively benign. Some of them have a profusely beneficial effect on the possibilities of human intelligence or creativity or understanding or awareness. And obviously, we need to learn how to differentiate, right? You can pretty much tell if you're walking down some path like I am now and you see an animal, you can determine whether or not that animal mostly represents either a threat, right? Or you are neutral to it, or it represents an opportunity. And there's lots of different opportunities besides hunting the animal, by the way. You can follow the animal and learn things, astonishing things. Now, the narratives one has about the relationship between human beings and nature, those might be among the most profoundly important narratives to resurrect, to enhance. Because mostly what we have are utilitarian narratives. Particularly at the level of our supercultures, nature is just something to be turned into commodities, which are in turn transformed into power or profit. That's a game that'll get everything dead right quick with our current population levels, and is a pretty bad game no matter what your population level is. But what I want to imply or highlight is just this. We need to learn how to differentiate between narratives that cripple or repurpose our intelligence in a very negative way, narratives that are relatively neutral, presuming there are such things, and narratives that can expand and enhance and advance our potentials for intelligent cooperation, for intelligent social cooperation, for awareness, for enhancing the health of our memory and the purposes for which we, relate with it. We can learn together. I know that we can. And this kind of understanding that I'm here presenting is the spark that lights this fuse, right? Once we realize that narratives structure memory, that certain forms of memory contribute to or inhibit certain possibilities of human awareness or intelligence, and that some narratives are toxic and can be weaponized against entire peoples. Others are relatively neutral. Still others are, what is the right word? Others catalyze and nurture forms of intelligence and awareness that exist as potential within us that for generations of human beings have lived and died without tasting for themselves. And for me, this is such a wonderful insight, so provocative and compelling, that I just feel absolutely lucky to have stumbled on it in this conversation the other night. I've thought about memory very deeply for many years. I'm profoundly aware of the incredibly intense relationship between individuals, societies, and narratives. It's almost impossible to not be aware of that in a climate where people are fighting over political ideologies or religious ideologies or philosophical ideologies. It's blatantly obvious that we're, if I had to say one of the things that makes us unusual animals, it would be our relationship with narratives. And we furiously, contagiously exchange them, right? But nobody's paying attention to that process from above it. And if we move to that position above it, if we suspend our own relationship briefly with narrative, personal identity, specific forms of memory, then we can begin to develop the skills that will enable us to relate with narratives more intelligently, to develop the faculties that we've thus far been denied, many of which would probably appear to us, were we to see them in their raw human expression, they might appear supernatural. They might appear like something from science fiction. But we are capable of far more than anything that has ever been written. And this is the fundamental message that I hope to share, is that it's not that we're using 1/10 of our brain. If you used 100% of your brain, your head would probably melt. It's not that we're using 10% of our brain. It's that we're using 3% of the faculties that are native to our kind of animal. And that percentage is catastrophically falling as our people progress technologically, right? It's almost like we're investing in machines, the advancements that should have become, analogs of, actually crude analogs of the advancements that should have become common to human individuals and social groups, right? And that's a tragedy I feel we must address. We must recognize, acknowledge, and address together. There is so much more I want to say about this, but I just feel grateful to have had this opportunity to get this far today together with you. I would ask you to pay attention to the methods you use in your efforts to disambiguate phenomenon, particularly your own identity, and to pay attention to the astonishing powers of dreaming to re-ambiguate relationships, identities, situations, and even objects. I look forward to having more time together soon. Thank you so much for joining me. May you be well. May you be safe. And may we together recover some of the potentials of the astonishing continuum of human intelligence. Bye-bye for now.